Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to Watch Chronicler. The iconic and now 26-year-old Breguet Type 20 reference 3800 is no more and awaits, I can only assume, a replacement. But what exactly can we expect from this historic company? Well, I reckon that if we are to really predict what Breguet will serve us next, we need to take a look at the brand and justify the Type 20 in any form as, perhaps the most iconic aviation chronograph, is an incongruous product. You see, Breguet is a brand which, when one thinks about it, has a very inconsistent history as the primary consequence of a wildly overachieving family in two distinct fields. Abraham Louis Breguet, Breguet I if you will, was a genius. If asked, almost any watchmaker or horological enthusiast will cite Breguet as the finest mind in the watchmaking field at any point in its history. Of course, many brilliant minds have, do, and will produce new and exciting inventions, or even styles of watchmaking such as George Daniel or François-Paul Journe, but all have reverence for Breguet. As a watchmaker at the turn of the 19th century, Breguet's list of inventions was extensive. The tourbillon, the basic crown, automatic winding, and even arguably the first wristwatch. As a consequence of his superlative technical mastery, pretty much every history book person of note from the 1780s until the restoration of the French monarchy owned a Breguet. In fact, both Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, and Napoleon owned Breguets, and it's even conceivable they might have used them both on that fateful day in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo. However, quite aside from an inimitable influence on the evolution of watchmaking, and in reality even the way we approach horology today, Breguet ceased to be the same after the death of that most prominent founding member. Instead, it was for the endeavours of Louis-Charles Breguet that the brand remained relevant into the 20th century. You see, this heavily moustached man was a pioneer of aviation, a natural progression given that his great-great-grandfather was the horologist, and his grandfather was Louis-François Clément Breguet, the man who introduced electrical telegraphs to France. This third great Breguet developed and produced some of the most successful French military aircraft of the First World War, and created the antecedent of Air France in 1919. In this context, the development of the de facto pilot's chronograph on account of its long-standing civilian and military use is rather unsurprising. Now, I have in the past considered and discussed the complex and often erroneously explained history of the Breguet Type 20, but curiously it's the modern Type 20 which forms the basis of this discourse. You see, having been effectively relaunched in the late 20th century, Breguet's aim of being the Swatch Group, or its predecessor's answer to Patek Philippe and other brands in the rarefied world of high horology, was fundamentally at odds with a military aviation chronograph. Breguet was to be a brand punctuated with guilloché patterns and driven by complex, supremely well-decorated movements. By comparison, at that point the closest the Type 20 had ever come to luxury was in its gold forms produced, I believe, for higher-ranking officers in the French Air Force, Navy or aircraft testing divisions. But even with the obvious incongruity of launching a military-style chronograph, Breguet had a lot of back catalogue to play with. You see, from start to finish, Breguet had an enormous range of different interpretations of their chronograph, but fundamentally these fell into three distinct series within two generations of watches. Designed loosely after the Hanhart watches discovered by France after the Black Forest was overrun after the Second World War, the original Breguet Type 20 was a rather delicate piece and clearly related very closely to preceding pilot's watches, rather than being its own species from the start. This is very well illustrated by Breguet's last Type 20 offered for the 2019 Only Watch charity auction. Based on the earliest military interpretations of the Type 20, the crown is onion-shaped for traditional grip, the bezel displays only a single marker and has a very thin understated construction, and the hands still have a very quaint, curvy form. The next Type 20 displayed the move to the most recognisable iteration, which, to seriously simplify history, emerged around the time when the Type 20 was offered not only to the military, but also to the civilian customer. Let's not forget that it was at this time that Breitling was offering its original 806 Navitimer and 765 chronograph, a similar design to the Breguet, and a watch, some say, which was originally designed for military use. This generation enlarged the minute counter for emphasis, offered bigger, better pushers, and a modern crown. Even the bezel was altered to give more meaningful information at a glance, rather than simply being a placeholder, as was the case on the original design. It's this design which has been mimicked by the 2021 edition of that Only Watch piece, produced for this year's auction in a single unique example. The third iteration, but confusingly only the second generation of the Breguet Type 20, was the most accomplished, yet remains by far the least known. Launched in the early 1970s when Breguet was taken over by Parisian jewellery firm Journe, the second generation Type 20 featured the same square lugs and black-coated technical bezel as an early 1970s Sinn 101, the predecessor of today's 103, and as a consequence this was also a very similar watch to some Bell & Ross pieces produced in the late 20th century, which were also produced by Sinn. In actual fact, it's hard to tell which of these watches arrived first, but I can't imagine that two near-identical designs just happened to appear at the same time. Interestingly though, Breguet chose not to use any of these designs to bring back the Type 20 in the early 90s. A key hint towards this choice was the decision to write Type 20 in Roman and not Arabic numerals. This not only denoting a civilian product, not a military bearing, but also set the tone for these watches as aesthetic and traditional before being rugged and tough, even though the ultimate result was a watch which was still 100 meters water resistant and automatic. In any case, one could very justifiably consider the modern Type 20 to be one of the most enlightened watches of the 1990s when one looks over the whole market. Let's consider the alternatives on the market at the time. Omega's Speedmaster Professional was still very much a tool, albeit one now appreciated for its history and mechanical pedigree, and it took Omega until the late 1990s to provide its movement with a finish commensurate with the prestige it finally, rightfully commanded. Likewise, Zenith spent the 1990s experimenting with genuine military versions of the El Primero, with squat but quite charming and rather dated nowadays flyback chronographs with rotating bezels, rather similar to the Type 20 in principle, but without anything like the breadth of appeal. With the original 1994 Type 20 Aéronaval, Breguet provided something very different. Furnished with a less prestigious Lemania 1350 based caliber 582, this watch didn't have the high beat of the El Primero or the prestige of the Omega 861, but this tried and tested chronograph movement gave reliability and practicality with automatic winding, a cam-actuated chronograph, a flyback function as was crucial to this watch in principle, and Breguet's undoubted quality. The design, however, was the real triumph. Adopting the details of the civilian generation Type 20, this watch had a clearly graduated polished bezel, the unmistakable tri-compax dial with a large minute counter and hand. Even so, the polished case, soon available in all the obvious precious metals, took a great deal from Breguet's past horological roots, such as the accentuated curved form, large pushers and the ribbed case sides, as a reference to traditional French pocket watch cases. The fact that this is still produced and sold today in the forms of the Type 21 and Type 22 proves that the design was a successful one. Of course, the original Aéronaval wasn't the only Type 20, as soon enough Breguet launched the Transatlantique, essentially the date version of this 39mm watch. After this came the Type 21, a follow-up in 2004 with a larger 42mm case and a design taken beyond retro to the point of being mildly steampunk. In its design you could see the lozenges of First World War aircraft emblems, and whilst the Arabic numerals remained, they were plucked from the pioneering years of aviation with canvas wings and rotary engines. Aesthetically, this was a Type 20 format used to honour Breguet's aviation heritage and not its military watchmaking. The key change here, however, was that the caliber 584Q brought a central minute hand to the equation and replaced the minute subdial with a day-night or 24-hour indicator, a reasonable change given the increased size and therefore demand for increased functionality with this watch. Finally, Breguet finished off the current range with the Type 22, which was released in 2010. The reference 3880 was in many ways one of the most extreme sports watches released by any brand up to that point, yet never really caught buyers' attention despite the major brand name. Rising from 42 to 44mm, this watch was the first and only to offer a chronograph version of Breguet's incredible high beat movement. Using a tiny, essentially magnetically levitating balance wheel and an assortment of silicon parts, the caliber 589F runs at a staggering 72,000 vibrations per hour, which is displayed with a second hand running twice around the dial per minute. It's a real masterpiece. But with all that being said, the modern Type 20 is no spring chicken. Virtually no watch can be produced for such a period of time with neither facelift nor replacement, and as has become clear over the last few months, the original reference 3800 has finally been discontinued. Now, I should pause here and say that Breguet have plenty of very good reasons for this change. The movement, whilst hardly antiquated, was inextricable from Breguet's old ownership of Lemania, the original movement manufacturer. This company was bought by Breguet in 1992 before being integrated into the Swatch Group when Breguet was finally bought itself. Likewise, for all its charm and beauty, the Type 20 didn't make much financial sense to most buyers, given that Omega, a brand beneath it, had fielded far superior movements for years at the time of discontinuation. But given that the Type 21 and Type 22 collections, of which the former has seen new releases this year, hinge on the presence of the original Type 20 as a base model, it's only a matter of time before Breguet shows us what's next. Even so, what exactly that will be is no sure thing. On the one hand, if you go by Breguet's presence in the only watch auctions of the last few years, one could seriously imagine the Type 20 becoming a replica of the original references from the 50s. This choice would certainly follow market trends, and I'm sure would gather considerable steam as the role of vintage-inspired watches changes from a wink to the past into a real everyday alternative to a beautiful but long-in-the-tooth timepiece with limited reliability. There are, however, a few reasons which make me doubt this direction. The first is that, in the case of both the 2019 and 2021 only watch Type 20s, the design, thickness and overall construction were based upon the use of a vintage Veljoux 235 manual flybag movement. Assuming that recreating a vintage movement is off the table for reasons of reliability, inferior specifications, and of course the problem of the expense of recreating a movement which is fundamentally obsolete, Breguet simply has no movement which would fit the slender proportions of those pieces. Furthermore, where would this leave the existing Types 21 and 22, as their designs would no longer have any standard model to be anchored to? I simply don't know. Luckily, the other hand is an intriguing one. What if Breguet were to follow Blancpain's example? In rather a lot of ways, Blancpain and Breguet seem like far too similar brands to be under the single, albeit vast roof of the Swatch Group. Both were known for more traditional watches prior to the 20th century, and both produced military tools in the middle of it, before fading into obscurity and being resurrected on the merit of their dress watches, only to then become known for the resurgence of their most iconic sports models, the 50 fathoms in the case of Blancpain. In recent years, Blancpain has found a very neat way to keep standardization across their range, whilst milking their history. They produce essentially two 50 fathoms dive watches, the 40mm and 45mm size. For their vintage affairs, they changed the bezel, the dial and maybe the case finish. If Breguet were to reintroduce the Type 20 with a similar case style to the 3800, with a more elaborate and more modern chronograph movement, maybe even borrowed from another brand under the Swatch Group umbrella, and then launched periodic, vintage-inspired versions, just imagine the diversity that could give the brand, with some standardization and a sense of brand image. The only part of that which I don't really believe is the movement aspect. In reality, I wonder if Breguet will instead offer new components, such as a silicon escapement or maybe even a column wheel in the original Lemania movement, in order to bring it up to speed before retrofitting these changes to the Types 21 and 22. I must say, that combination of a historical and beautiful movement, the possibility to offer even more variants, and the option to indulge the collector's market seems like the chance to truly make the most iconic pilot's watch into a watch of the 21st century. But what do you think? What should Breguet do to update the Type 20? Let me know in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like, subscribe, and to hit the bell icon. It's really appreciated and crucial to keeping the videos coming. Thank you very much for watching. This is Armon from WatchChronicle.com. Out.